So anyway, so let me just start by kind of reviewing the purpose of this. So, you know, I think that there's an interesting, not divide, but an interesting difference in the way that I think a lot of us approach intensive intervention in the field. And I think that it's one reason that sometimes we're in like slightly different pages on things, you know, and I think it has a lot to do with this nomothetic versus idiographic difference. And by the way, it's idiographic, not idiopathic. So just a correction there on my part, my error. And the idea is obviously that, like, you know, you read in there, nomothetic is about general principles, extracting from, you know, our understanding of things, like what do we know about how human cognition works or human behavior works based on, you know, sort of the accumulated data, which leads to people thinking about designing interventions in ways that may be intensive, but are designed for, you know, groups of kids, are designed to sort of meet multiple needs as opposed to being specific to a kid. And the idea of idiographic is we focus on the individual kid's needs super specifically, and we don't attempt to generalize in the same way because our focus is just on that particular kid's particular needs. So I think that, you know, we're interested to hear from you because, you know, behavior folks, and I think in general way, tend to have a particular perspective on this that I think the scholars need to understand. And so I'm interested to we're interested to kind of hear you talk about how you fit into all of this stuff. So any questions before I start on my questions?
No.
Yeah. Okay. So will you characterize your work as taking an idiographic or nomothetic approach to designing and implementing interventions for students with disabilities?
Yeah.
Good answer, Brandy.
So on the behavior side of things, I think there's kind of a slight, as you already said, maybe a different way that we think about characterizing things. And I'm getting a lot of feedback, so I hope you guys are hearing this cleanly enough for it to work out.
I do hear a few. Let me mute myself.
Okay. So on kind of from a behavioral perspective, we think about the continuum of supports, much as I think you guys do on the academic side. So at kind of the tier 2 level, we think a little bit more about designing quick and efficient interventions that are going to serve targeted groups of kids. And so at that level, we do want those to still be based on individual student data, but we might be a little bit less precise or less worried about being very precise, because on the behavioral side of things, we would think about kind of students who demonstrate at-risk behaviors. Generally, we can look at the function of behavior in a very fast way for that group of kids, and we can develop some kind of targeted interventions that are likely to work across a group of students, and then those help us kind of screen for students who need a little bit more. So at that targeted or tier 2 level, we might use interventions like a check-in, check-out approach, which is most ideally suited for kids whose behaviors function to get or obtain adult attention, but isn't harmful to kids in other groups and can be easily tweaked to meet some other functions. So I'd say at tier 2, it's a little bit of a hybrid, but we care a little bit more about a quick and easy approach to support a group than we do about highly individualized and intensive interventions. But as we move kind of up the triangle and we start getting towards like tier 2.5, tier 3, and so we're kind of thinking again of like a true continuum, as we increase in the intensity of need and increase in the intensity of support, we also increase in the intensity of data and the individualization that we're doing. So kind of from a behavioral perspective, we're generally guided by the idea that behavior serves a function. So kids are engaging in behavior, good, bad, or indifferent, to either get something that they, have a history of getting access to with their behavior, or to get away from something that they have a history of getting away from with their behavior. So we think about that in terms of history of positive reinforcement or history of negative reinforcement. And again, kind of as we go up the triangle, that becomes even more important in terms of guiding our decisions about interventions. And while that sounds kind of generic and like you could group kids then into 2 groups, the way in which that plays out and the unique interplay between their behavior and the environmental context really do require a level of individualization that you couldn't just say, oh, kid fits into group A, get a chain. and have a cookie cutter intervention, because you need to make that targeted to the individual and tailored to the environment in which that individual is kind of engaging in those behaviors. So I would say the need for it to be idiographic, to use your word, as you go up the triangle becomes more and more important. And at the tier 2 level, we're a little bit more forgiving about just trying to get kids into a quick intervention to kind of address quick at-risk behaviors that hopefully can be remediated and move the student back into only needing tier 1 supports.
Okay, that's great, Brandy. Thanks for that. Let me ask the second question. Yeah, well, I want to come, yeah, all right, let me just do that. I'll come back to my other questions. Has your research changed the way you think about the students you study? And the idea here is we're thinking about this quote from, I think it's Yuri Bronfenbrenner. I can't say the name correctly, but it's somebody. Yeah, okay. The best way to understand something is try to change it. And so, you know, people talk about how by doing interventions over time, you start to change the way you interpret student behavior, and it could send you either in a more idiographic direction or more noetic direction. You know, do you see more trends in behavior, or do you just notice that it really is more sort of individualized than you originally thought?
So I would say probably my research hasn't shaped as much as that as my practice did. So I went back into the field for a few years after I got my PhD, and I was the clinician and then ultimately the director of a school that served all kids with aggressive behavior, ages 3 up through 21. And in that setting, we were very data-driven, and it was an ABA-based setting. So we eventually published like a study based on my time there, but it was not a research focus. It was a practice focus. And I would say that it strengthened my understanding of behavioral theory. So in terms of, I guess, on kind of the continuum that you've described, it's kind of on the nomothetic side. So I definitely became an even stronger advocate and understander of kind of how behavior plays out. But it also showed me a greater range in terms of what that looks like across a variety of kids, because we had little kids with autism and older kids who were cognitively, you know, intact or maybe even brilliant, but had a lot of behavioral challenges. And so what it looks like to display problem behavior, even when it's all aggressive behavior, is very different in a little kid who's trying to get or obtain access to a tangible item that they don't know how to communicate for, versus an older kid who's trying to use much more complex behavior to get or obtain access to something that they want. In terms of my research, I think where I've started to take this and thought about it even more is in terms of supporting teachers and seeing that that same kind of approach actually plays out with adults, that's kind of where my research has pushed me, is thinking that one size probably doesn't fit all for adults either. We need to be thoughtful. And for me, again, that comes back to my understanding of behavioral theory, but how that plays out in a different context.
That's great. Thanks for that. So could these interventions you design, particularly the ones at Tier 3, but you can talk about the Tier 2 ones as well, be applied successfully to students without a need for intensive intervention? If so, do you do that? If not, what makes your work inappropriate for students without intensive needs?
So absolutely, the kind of elements in any good Tier 3 behavior plan are things we should be doing for all kids. So kind of thinking of a good Tier 3 behavior plan, first of all, it's based on individualized assessment data, which in an ideal world, we would have function-based assessment data for all kids. In a real world, I don't see that happening. But beyond that, the good elements are things like setting the students up for success with creating an environment that prompts appropriate behavior and removing things that trigger inappropriate behavior. So kind of really thinking on the antecedent side of things. And then being very thoughtful and planful about what behaviors we want kids to display and explicitly teaching them how to do those. And kind of then shaping from where they're at to even more and more elegant or kind of advanced displays of those behaviors. And making sure that the behaviors we want to see work for the kids. So in other words, they result in the appropriate reinforcement, and the behaviors we don't want to see don't work for the kids. So that looks very individualized and intensive at Tier 3, but those exact same elements absolutely should be part of your good classroom management skills in Tier 1 and good kind of school-wide discipline approach in Tier 1. And those elements should also be slightly intensified at Tier 2. So while I wish everyone's kind of plan was guided by much more impressive data. I actually think those same exact elements show up across all of the tiers. It's just kind of the tweaking and the refinement and the intensity with which they're delivered that kind of increase. Kind of another way of thinking about that, so I described my job in my school, is tier 1 in that setting is a much more intensive version of those same exact things, because in that setting, you need to intensify the practices at tier 1 to meet everybody's needs. And tier 3 in that school was incredibly intensive, sometimes administered in a really, one-on-one staffing ratio, even in one of our typical classrooms. So the short answer is absolutely. I think those same intervention approaches can be delivered and should be delivered at tier 1, and even tier 1, depending on the intensity of the setting, can be adjusted.
Yeah, that's really, it's really interesting to get this perspective, because it makes sense in the context of work that you've done, right? It's totally, it's how PBS is sort of designed in a way, right? It's very much about that kind of application. That's great. So let me ask you, before I go on to the other questions, so when you think about the work that I do and Mike does and people like us do you think that it's possible that really what we're doing is tier 2?
I think, and I obviously don't have the in-depth understanding of all the instructional side of things, but I always come back to good instruction is really good instruction. And as you intensify that for kids, I'm not sure I see it as completely distinct or different from the behavior side of things. And maybe that's just because I'm naive and don't understand all of it. But to me, there are things that are going to work for all kids. And when we know that those things aren't working, it might be a dosing issue, or it might be some piece of that we intensify those elements. And kind of thinking about students in my school, as we, differentiated instruction and we met the needs of kids who are on a functional academic track, kids who are, in school earning a typical diploma, some of the elements of good instruction were in place for all of those kids. They looked a little bit different. So I don't know if I would say what you guys do is tier 2, but I would say the elements of what you study could actually be implemented and intensified across all of the tiers.
Okay, that's it. That's good. That makes good sense. So I think this is a particularly interesting one from your point of view. The next question: as we learn more about cognition and human development, do you expect the field will move more in an idiographic or noetic direction in the design and implementation of our interventions? Do you think in your area you're likely to see such change?
It's a good question. Part of me feels like we understand a great deal about human behavior in terms of what's functional. So I do think that science is going to teach us a little bit more about brain behavior interactions and kind of different places that we haven't been able to see, that we might be able to actually see and directly observe things because of our new technologies. But I'm not actually sure how much that's going to change what good practice looks like, at least from the kind of my side of the world. Because I do think that there's kind of an economy of scale piece where we need to do those interventions that are likely to work for most kids with most kids. And it's possible we might get more elegant in terms of how we individualize as we move up the tiers, but I don't think it's going to dramatically change the way we approach things in terms of having a continuum of support in that piece. Again, I could be just not aware of where we're headed, but I don't see like a huge game changer. Where I do think we're going to get more elegant as we move forward is kind of on the integration and interplay among the different approaches. Like I think that as we have kids who have a lot of complex needs, right now we tend to kind of approach those from our own boxes. And I think partly that's because of the tools that we currently have. So it's possible that while good behavior intervention is going to be a good behavior intervention and good academic intervention is going to be good academic intervention and good mental health is going to be good mental health, I do think that as we have kids that have more complex needs across all of the different domains, we might get better at meeting those needs across the different disciplines than we are right now.
Great. That's really, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting. So what area of study within all of this would you regard as very important and very understudied?
I think I spend most of my time in terms of research and even in terms of practice thinking about why it's so hard to get those good basic practices to be implemented really well across more and more environments. So not that there aren't places that we need to go in terms of better supporting kids, and I do think some of that really is the integration pieces. But I think especially as we're kind of thinking about all of the needs of kids that schools end up having to meet, getting the adults to be able to do those things consistently and, you know, across time is one of those areas that I don't think we have enough data to support. You know, there's the new field or, you know, emerging field of implementation science that folks have been working on for over a decade now, but still feels relatively new. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in that area and a lot of learning. And, you know, from my perspective, I always think about a behavioral solution or approach to that piece. But to me, it's like getting adults to support kids and doing those practices in the middle of all the competing demands that they have. Because I genuinely think most of us are in the field because we want to make life better for students and we want to promote learning. But we've got so much on our plates and so many barriers to doing that that it's hard to sometimes have that happen.
That's really interesting. You're not the first person to talk about teachers. And I think we experience that in the academic world too, right? I mean, like, we struggle in the same way every year. You know, it's like, how do we get it to the next level? How do we get it, you know, widely disseminated and used effectively? I mean, you know, IES is focusing on teacher implementation this year in NICSR, and in some ways it like makes a lot of sense to me because, like, sure, we can design this really cool intervention, but if nobody does it, you know, no teacher is able to implement it, then ultimately what's the societal value of that, right? So I think that's really interesting. Before I go on to ask you about the resources, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about just sort of, you know, in general, what are some of your thoughts about this topic and you know, thoughts for the scholars to think about with regard to all this?
I mean, I think in general, the idea of intensive interventions is really, it's an interesting one, but it implies there are interventions in place to intensify, which seems like a no-brainer, right? But it is that idea of knowing, like, whether you're thinking academics, behavior, or whatever, kind of what are those interventions that should be in place, should be implemented really well, and knowing that that's there before thinking about how to tweak. I mean, it's hard to know if a kid is responding to good instruction or good behavior support if they're not getting it. So I do think that even though we're focused on the kind of intensive side of things, thinking about what that means in terms of what's there already, what's in the classroom, what's in the school. And the other piece that we've had conversations with outside of this context is just what are the systems features that need to be in place to enable this to happen? So if we're wanting teachers to implement good intensive academic or behavioral interventions, what professional development do they need? What coaching do they need? What are the policies, especially on the behavioral side? If we've got a school that's wanting to suspend kids every time they act out, but a teacher who's wanting to run an intensive behavior plan, those two things can be in conflict with each other. So I think for me, even though the focus is on intensive interventions, it's also making sure that Tier 1 is in place and then thinking about the supports that have to be there for the teachers in the building to enable them to successfully have a good shot at implementing well.
Yeah, well, I want to follow up on that. You and I have had this conversation before. Like, what if teachers are in a school where, like, that can't be changed and, you know, they are attempting to put an intensive intervention in place. And, you know, we are teaching classes where we don't control a system. We teach individual students and, you know, and so, or, you know, and in the research world, we do a study where we recruit the teacher and the teacher is really on board, you know, even a group of teachers, but we can't change the school system. You know, I know in the PBIS work, you guys often do have a school, you know, wide system, but, you know, there are going to be cases where, you know, we want to encourage teachers to do this work, but they don't have that. So what do we do about that? I mean, do we just have to say, like, well, until that happens, you're going to struggle? Anyway, just, you know what I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the behavior side, the policy piece can be really difficult. I think That is, there's always the debate about whether it's a good thing to have a kid identified or not. And, there's various opinions on that of whether we should be focusing on prevention of kids being identified or whether we should really see the supports of special ed being a good thing. But I do think this is one of those places where the supports of special ed are a really good thing. So if I'm a teacher and I have a student whose, behavior is escalating beyond a level that good classroom management is going to support, I can go and I can probably read or take a class and learn about a tier 2 targeted intervention. And I can probably do a pretty good job in my classroom of implementing a check-in, check-out system, whether I have the best data and whatever, I can still probably do a pretty good job of implementing that practice. And we have some nice research of teachers doing just that. But when it gets above that, kind of on a behavioral side of things, and I'm assuming the same might be true on the academic side, it's beyond the individual teacher to solve that problem. I mean, because it might require a level of expertise that someone can't get in one class or in reading a book. And depending on the severity of the behavior, it might actually present safety risks that one person shouldn't be, trying to manage on their own. So I do think if you're the teacher and you don't have good school-wide support, using the protections if the student is eligible and if the student is identified, but using the protections in special ed to advocate for both the best services for that student, but also for the best training for yourself, which can be, as we know, kind of written into a student's individualized program. I think we have historically done a pretty bad job of this on the behavior side when we don't have school-wide change, and that's why we do have so many students outplaced, because it's beyond an individual teacher's capacity. And if you don't have a good kind of school and district level support piece, kids either fall through the cracks or bounce out of the district. So I don't want to say like teachers can't go at it alone, but I do think there's a level at which teachers shouldn't go at it alone. And I think that level usually comes around tier 3 on the behavior side of things.
That makes a lot of sense. It's interesting to think about all the these pieces put together. So the final question is, what papers and other resources would you recommend the scholars access to better understand this from a behavioral point of view?
The resource that I love is the PBIS Center website, and that's a federally funded center, so everything on there is free, and there's a wealth of information, which makes it kind of overwhelming to navigate. But even just the content, when you kind of flip through the main pages of the web page, gives you a good perspective on what the tiers look like. There's examples of that in high school, in juvenile justice centers. There's some videos that are resources. In terms of individual classroom, there was a group of us from the National Center that worked on a technical brief for classrooms. And it's one that the Office of Special Ed Programs actually then took from us in a very good way and polished it up and made it even, I think, in some ways prettier. And it's a document called Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior. And it's up on the OSEP website, but that's always harder for me to navigate. So it's also up on pbis.org. And it's a document that's a little bit long if you tried to read it cover to cover, but there's some good interactive tools that allow kind of easy navigating if you're looking at it on a computer. I mean, there's a wealth of kind of books and articles and stuff out there, but in terms of like the go-to places for practitioners, those are the 2 places that we usually go. In terms of research, there's an entire Journal of Positive Behavioral Interventions. It's a relatively new journal. And especially in the last 5 years or so, the level and quality of publications has really, it's kept up with trends in our research. And so I think that's a go-to place also to think about kind of for a topic of interest, searching within that journal to get a good perspective on kind of what is the research saying.
That's great. Okay, well, those sound like good resources. I think this is really helpful, Brandy, to, you have a unique perspective on this that, I mean, we haven't seen on either side. And so I think it's really great to see that. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. And I think the scholars are really going to benefit from watching. So I guess that's it.